Willkommen in einem anderen video, or welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 4 of my Core Commander video series covering the Core Commander rules, in this case covering specifically the command phase. All elements need to be in command control in order to function normally. Command control is determined during the command control subphase of the phasing command phase. Once an element is in command control, or out of command control, it remains so until the following command control subphase of the phasing command phase. Command control is required for an element to move normally, act as an observer for fire support or air support, and receive any orders. If an element is not in command control, it can only move on a 10-sided die roll of 6 or greater. This applies to headquarters as well. If an element is not in command control, it cannot act as an observer in order to bring down fire support or air support. This includes area fire and interdiction fire. If an element is not in command control, it cannot receive any new orders and remains under any existing orders. Lack of command control has a major effect on an element and should be avoided at all costs. An element is in command control if it can trace a line of communication to its commanding headquarters. There are 3 types of lines of communication. These are land, radio, and telephone. A land line of communication represents messages on foot or in small vehicles. A radio line of communication represents elements communicating by the use of radio. A telephone line of communication represents elements communicating by phone joined by laid wires or lines. A land line of communication can be up to 40 centimetres long. When tracing through swamps, forests, jungles, rough or broken terrain, the distance covered is doubled. So tracing a land line of communication through 6 centimetres of forests represents 12 centimetres. A land line of communication may not be traced through opportunity fire range of enemy elements or through the target areas for area or interdiction fire. A land line of communication may not be traced through unbridged rivers or other prohibited terrain. A radio line of communication can be any length and is only limited by the intervening terrain and the effects of electronic warfare. A radio line of communication may not pass through hills. A radio line of communication may not pass through more than 40 centimetres of blocking terrain. Towns, woods, forests, jungles and cities are blocking terrain, with forests and cities counting as double the distance. A radio line of communication must be a straight line between the element and its controlling headquarters. A radio line of communication may be intercepted by an enemy intercept element that can trace a line of communication to the point from where the message was broadcast. This is the only downside of using a radio line of communication. It is also possible enemy electronic warfare could affect a radio line of communication. A telephone line of communication is unlimited in length between the emplaced headquarters or between an emplaced headquarters and a fortified subordinate element. The length of the telephone line between emplaced headquarters and their unfortified subordinate element is 75 centimetres. A telephone line of communication may not be traced through opportunity fire range of enemy elements or through the target areas of area or interdiction fire. A telephone line of communication may not be traced through unbridged rivers or other prohibited terrain. Measurement of a telephone line of communication through swamps, forests, jungle, rough or broken terrain is treated as double the distance. A headquarters cannot function when it's disrupted or routing. In this case, subordinate elements would be out of command control. A superior headquarter could resubordinate these elements to a new headquarters, but this all takes time, and in the meantime the element's effectiveness is greatly reduced. An element which can trace a line of communication to its commanding headquarters, which in turn is out of command control, is also out of command control. The loss of a regiment or brigade headquarters would be catastrophic. We will now cover supply. In order for an element to move and conduct fire combat, it requires fuel and ammunition, which is referred to as general supply in the game. If it lacks general supply, its movement and combat capability can be degraded. Unlike board games, this is not determined in a simple manner, as general supply was often held at an element level. the commanding headquarters level, and so on. Thus, breaking a line of supply did not immediately have an effect. An element has four basic supply states. It has a line of supply, it has no line of supply, it is out of supply, and finally it's depleted. This is determined during the supply subphase of the phasing command phase. Once determined, this supply state remains until the following phasing supply state. The supply effects depends on the supply state an element is currently experiencing. If it has a line of supply, it can move and fire normally. If it does not have a line of supply, it can move and fire normally, but may do this only for 4 game turns, after which it is out of supply. When an element is out of supply, each time it moves or fires, if a vehicle or artillery, or fires only, if not, it has a chance of becoming depleted. When an element is depleted, it cannot move or fire, and can only defend against a close assault. It basically becomes an element which can be safely ignored by the enemy. A line of supply originates from the player's edge of the playing area. It can travel along a road any distance, which represents vehicles carrying heavy loads on prepared surfaces, such as a road. It can travel up to 50 centimetres to a brigade or regimental headquarters. From the brigade or regimental headquarters, it can travel up to 50 centimetres to any subordinate element or subordinate battalion headquarters. The 50 centimetre range that I've just mentioned is across any terrain. From the subordinate battalion headquarters, it can be traced a further 30 centimetres. If playing the optional player edge supply source, supply can be traced across cross-country up to 25 centimetres from the friendly player edge. A supply line to a brigade or regimental headquarters cannot be traced through enemy opportunity fire range. This includes when it's being traced along a road, player edge, or cross-country. In other cases, a supply line can be traced through enemy opportunity fire range. A supply line cannot be traced over unbridged river or waterway, but it can be traced over a ford or stream. All supply lines count double the distance through swamp, heavy woods, forest, jungle, or broken terrain. In this example, the regimental headquarters is taking supply from the friendly player edge, which happens to be 20 centimetres. It cannot trace a line of supply to the road because this is beyond 50 centimetres. The elements in the 1st and 2nd Battalion can directly trace a line of supply to the regimental headquarters, as can the 2 M106 elements. The 3rd Battalion headquarters is too far away from the regimental headquarters, but can trace a line of supply to the road. It then provides a line of supply to the elements in the 1st Battalion. All elements have a line of supply in this example. If an element has no line of supply, it has 4 game turns of general supply, unless it's fatigued or exhausted, in which case it's immediately out of supply. The owning player should place a no line of supply marker next to it and a general supply marker 4 next to it as well. Each game turn it has no line of supply, the general supply marker is reduced by 1. This occurs during the supply subphase of the phasing command phase. If at any time a line of supply is re-established, remove all markers. Apart from this, there is no effect. When all general supply is expended, the element is out of supply. They still possess organic supply, but there is a chance this could become expended. Each time the element conducts a direct fire, including firing a missile, it must spin a 10-sided dice and will become depleted on an 8 or greater if infantry, or 6 or greater if a gun or vehicle. The only exception is non-missile opportunity fire. In addition, any vehicle may become depleted if it moves more than half its movement allowance in a movement phase and spins a 10-sided dice with a result of 6 or greater, resulting in depletion. Depleted elements may not move or fire until a supply line is reopened. It may, however, defend against a close assault as normal, except it will have no opportunity fire. Missiles are large, bulky items in comparison to other ammunition, and elements usually only carry a limited supply. To represent this, all missile-carrying elements have been given a missile supply rating. This is the number of missiles that may be fired in one game turn due to any cause, including opportunity fire. Both anti-tank guided weapons and anti-aircraft guided weapons are affected by this, and some thought must be given to their expenditure in a move, especially anti-aircraft guided weapons. Artillery can only conduct indirect fire when they have general supply. This means when they lose a line of supply, they can only conduct indirect fire for the following 4 game turns. Once they are out of supply, they can only conduct direct fire, including opportunity fire as per standard elements. They may not conduct indirect fire. All the general supply rules above apply to artillery, and while they remain in general supply, they receive 1 general supply point per turn. This is enough to cover all normal high explosive and smoke fire for that turn. However many times it is called upon to fire in a game. Artillery can conduct intensive fire, which expends an additional supply point per -1 modifier. An artillery element can expend up to 3 additional supply points for a total of 4 supply points to achieve a -3 modifier in a single game turn. This only applies to indirect fire and requires the artillery element to have the required supply points available. In most games, an artillery element will start the game with 4 supply points. Gaining 1 per game turn, it has a line of supply. It can thus expend all 4 in 1 game turn, and if it did not fire for the following 4 game turns, it could have 4 general supply points at the end of the phasing supply subphase. While not stated in the rules, the maximum amount of general supply any element can possess at any point in time is 4. We will now cover emplacement. Only indirect fire elements, or artillery, and headquarters can and need to emplace. The emplacement rules portray the time and difficulties involved in establishing a communication link between artillery and an observer. It also portrays the time and difficulty involved in establishing a telephone line of communication between headquarters and elements in fortifications, and headquarters and elements not in fortifications. 2 headquarters, which are in place, can communicate with each other using a telephone line of communication of any length. A headquarters which is in place can use a telephone line of communication of unlimited length to any subordinate element which is fortified. A headquarters which is in place can use a telephone line of communication up to 75 centimetres in length to any subordinate element which is not fortified. An indirect fire element has to be emplaced in order to provide fire support to an observer if it's allocated to a headquarters. This represents setting up a special communication link between the artillery element and the headquarters, which would not normally exist in a standard chain of command. The subordinate indirect fire element has the same type of communication line with its commanding headquarters, but this is considered to always exist as part of the standard chain of command. If the artillery element was attached to the battalion headquarters, then it would also have a line of communication style of communication link, and would no longer need to be emplaced. Of course, in this case, the artillery element would need to be in command control of its new commanding headquarters, which would normally require a radio line of communication, which could be affected by enemy electronic countermeasures or be intercepted. To overcome this, the artillery element would still need to be emplaced, as would the headquarters, in order to use a telephone line of communication. As a result, this is rarely done. In order to emplace, an element must be within 20 centimetres of its commanding headquarters, or is itself a headquarters. The controlling headquarters must be in concentrated mode and cannot be disrupted or routing. Towed weapons must be unlimbered to attempt to emplace. Once these conditions are met, the emplacement can begin. This occurs during the emplacement subphase of the phasing command phase. During subsequent emplacement phases, there must always be a controlling headquarters within 20 centimetres of the emplaced indirect fire element to maintain their emplacement or emplacing status. For headquarters which are emplacing, they must be in concentrated mode and cannot be disrupted or routing. They do not need to be within 20 centimetres of their controlling headquarters, as they take the place of the controlling headquarters in the emplacement process. If for any reason the condition for emplacement is not met, the counters are all removed and the element must start to emplace again from the beginning. If an element or headquarters is eligible to emplace, then at the beginning of the phasing emplacement subphase, an emplacement factor marker bearing a number equal to the controlling headquarters emplacement factor is placed adjacent to each newly emplaced element. A headquarters emplacing uses the emplacement factor of itself. As you can see from the emplacement factor table, once you apply modifiers, a self-propelled howitzer or gun of under 155mm is immediately in place. An indirect fire element with a modified emplacement factor of less than 1 automatically emplaces during the first emplacement subphase. If during the phasing emplacement subphase a player has elements or headquarters with an emplacement factor marker, he can spin a 10-sided dice to determine if the value is reduced by 1. Any die roll of more than 3 results in the emplacement factor being reduced by 1. Once the counter is reduced to 0, the element or headquarters is emplaced. In the later Corps Commander The Road to Berlin, MMG, tank and assault gun elements can emplace. For the tank and assault gun, it needs to have a main weapon which can fire high explosive ammunition. Otherwise it cannot conduct indirect fire and thus there's no point to emplace. For an MMG, the high explosive is replaced by the spraying of bullets, which achieves the same effect. Infantry guns and mortars, which are integral to a battalion, do not need to emplace if they are supporting that battalion only. This means the observer must be subordinate to the same battalion headquarters. Artillery elements which are integral to a brigade or regiment do not need to emplace if they are supporting that brigade or regiment only, which means the observer must be directly subordinate to the brigade or regimental headquarters. Note that observers which are subordinate to a headquarters which is in turn subordinate to the brigade or regiment headquarters does not count in this case. We will now cover communications or missions and orders. During the communication subphase of the phasing command phase, players activate previously sent orders or missions, send new orders, and then the non-phasing player may attempt to intercept those communications if they are sent by radio. All orders or missions sent last game turn become active during the phasing communication subphase. Supply allocating orders are sent during the supply subphase. Combat orders and resubordination orders are sent during the phasing communication subphase. Artillery missions orders are sent during the artillery subphase, and aircraft orders or missions are sent during the aircraft subphase. Artillery allocation orders occur during the artillery subphase. Aircraft allocation orders occur during the air operations subphase. During the communication subphase, combat orders can be sent from headquarters to subordinate headquarters. In most cases, this will be the regimental headquarters to its subordinate battalion headquarters. The combat orders are attack, defend, manoeuvre and retreat. There are minimal rules concerning these orders, but an attack order should include an objective to attack, a defend order should contain an objective to defend, a retreat order an objective to retreat to. An attack should involve some movement towards the objective, or fire combat against the enemy in the way. A defend order can involve some adjustment of elements, but basically does not allow any advance or retreat. A retreat order should involve some movement towards the retreat objective. Elements can only adopt travel mode if it's under manoeuvre or retreat orders. Elements can only adopt disperse mode if under defend orders. Apart from these simple requirements, players should use common sense. It takes one game turn for a combat order to be communicated to a subordinate. If the order needs to apply to a headquarters further down the command chain, this must be communicated separately, which takes an additional game turn. If players have a divisional headquarters, this situation could occur. It should also be noted that if a regiment is under attack orders, more than half of its subordinate headquarters must be under attack orders. Players must ensure this occurs when possible. There is one automatic order change. Any headquarters under a manoeuvre order automatically changes to defend order when enemy elements are sighted or it comes under direct fire attack. During the administrative order communication step, a headquarters can detach elements or headquarters from their commanding headquarters and attach them to a new headquarters. A headquarters can only do this for subordinate elements. If a player wanted to attach an artillery element, reporting to the artillery regimental headquarters, to a battalion headquarters, this could only be done by the divisional headquarters. Of course, this could be done before a game begins, but as indicated before, this does cause some issues with keeping the artillery element in command control. Look, in general cases, there is almost no allocation during the game. You basically assign everything at the beginning and that's the way it stays for the entire game. If a headquarters sends an order or mission using a radio line of communication, it can be intercepted. Only enemy signals companies or platoons would have this capability, So it would be a headquarters company nominated with a radio intercept capability. If the intercept element can trace a radio line of communication to the headquarters sending the communication, it spins a 10-sided dice. If it spins a 1 or 2, the order or mission is intercepted and the opposing player can view it. If he spun a 1, he can target the headquarters with indirect fire from an indirect fire element, which reports to the headquarters with counter battery fire capability, which is a AR value. This indirect fire is unobserved and occurs during the next game turn during the fire phase, specifically during the counter battery subphase. An intercept can occur for any communication sent during the command phase. Thus, a supply allocation order sent during the supply subphase could be intercepted, as can an artillery allocation or mission order or an aircraft allocation or mission order. The intercept step is placed in the communication subphase for convenience. An intercept die roll occurs once for any use of a radio line of communication, not for each order or mission communicated. The first time a headquarters uses a radio line of communication to send a communication, such as an order, artillery mission order, or aircraft mission order, the intercept die roll occurs. The result is used for all subsequent use of a radio line of communication during the current phasing command phase. This is more important for the highest rank headquarters on the playing area, normally a regimental headquarters. It could send up to 3 orders in a single game turns to its 3 subordinate battalion headquarters, and any number of artillery or aircraft allocation orders, resubordination orders, or artillery and aircraft mission orders. As some of these will be to an off-playing area headquarters or element, unless the headquarters is in place, it will always be using a radio line of communication. Radio jamming or electronic countermeasures can interfere with all radio communication on the playing area. Only a special signal company or platoon would have this capability, so it would be a headquarters company with a radio jamming capability. Radio jamming can be intercepted. The game provides no rules around how this would work. Players are free to create their own rules, but I would suggest that spin a 10-sided dice and that would stop radio lines of communication or something of that nature. We will now be covering artillery missions. An artillery element, or any indirect fire element, can conduct fire combat in the same manner as any other element. It can execute direct fire or self-observed indirect fire without any special condition and is only limited by the technical restrictions of the weapon itself. However, if an artillery element wishes to conduct special indirect fire activities such as fire support missions, counter battery missions, area fire missions or interdiction fire missions, there are a number of unique factors to consider. If a mission requires an observer, some thought has to go to ensure the communication link between the observer and the indirect fire element is suitable. If an indirect fire element is integral to a headquarters, then it can use the standard command lines of communication to any other element reporting to the same headquarters. If the artillery element is not integral to the observer's headquarters and reports to a different headquarters and wishes to remain so, it must be allocated to the observer's headquarters. Counter-battery missions do not require an observer, but its commanding headquarters, which has an artillery rating, acts as the observer. In most cases, the artillery element will be integral to this headquarters. The next factor to consider is the mission order the artillery element is currently under. This represents the artillery elements preparing for a specific action, so if an artillery element is under an area fire mission, then that's all it could do. It could not provide fire support instead. A new mission order would need to be provided. In the case of area fire and interdiction fire, these mission orders are pre-planned and the owning player needs to take no action to make this occur. Thus, if an artillery element was under a fire support mission order and on game turn 2 it was to fire an area fire mission, this would automatically change to area fire in game turn 2 and then automatically change back to fire support on game turn 3. Thus, the only 2 orders a player need to consider is fire support missions or counter battery missions. A third possible order is cancelling area fire or interdiction fire, and this allows an artillery element to conduct fire support or counter battery fire on that particular game turn. As with all orders, the new order takes effect the following game turn. In the game turn it was sent, the old order would still apply. All elements are organic to a formation, which in turn reports to a headquarters. Organic means the element was part of the official organisational structure. So in this example, on this slide, the M106 self-propelled mortar and the M901 missile tank destroyer is organic to the American Mechanised Infantry Battalion. They are also considered as integral to the battalion, as well as organic. The M106 self-propelled mortar can conduct a fire support mission without being emplaced, as long as the observer was also integral to the battalion. All organic elements are also considered as integral. An element can be attached to a headquarters, thus it was not originally organic, but after attached it becomes integral to that new formation. In this example, an M109 has been attached to the American Mechanised Infantry Battalion. As with the M106, the M109 can conduct fire support for any observer which is also reporting to the same headquarters. Of course, the M109 needs to be in command control of its battalion headquarters in order to do so. But in this case, the element may have been attached to provide short-range support against fortified enemy troops and will be within a landline communication range of its headquarters. Players can attach elements to headquarters before a game begins, but this has to be recorded. As I indicated before, normally all attachments occur before a game and remain so for the entire game. Any indirect fire element can be provided a pre-game area fire or interdiction fire mission order. This also applies to indirect fire elements which are organic and or integral to a battalion or regimental headquarters. Unless cancelled, this means it cannot provide fire support on that game to its parent formation. Counter battery is different, as the indirect fire element must report to a headquarters with an artillery rating or anti-radar rating. In theory, an indirect fire element could be allocated to an artillery headquarters with an artillery rating, but this would require a divisional headquarters to do so and would be unusual. You can do this before the game begins nonetheless, which is when it would occur. Any headquarters can attach and detach elements which are in its chain of command. This is called resubordination. If an element is not in the chain of command of a headquarters, it cannot do this. So in this slide, the non-artillery regiment or artillery regiment could not attach the M109 to the battalion headquarters. Only the divisional headquarters can do this. In order to conduct counter-battery fire, a player has to have a headquarters with an artillery rating value, which is normally the artillery regimental headquarters. In a typical attacking game, a player may have 2 artillery elements, which is probably too low to justify an artillery regimental headquarters. With so few artillery elements, the attacker will probably need all for fire support missions. While counter-battery fire capability would be useful in the second half of the game, typically the game would be won in the first half. The only argument for the attacker to possess counter-battery fire capability is the chance of disrupting an enemy headquarters due to a successful radio intercept. While a game changer, it's such a low probability event, most attackers would forego this opportunity. The defender, with a total of 18,000 points by midpoint of the game, would have more artillery and could justify counter-battery capability. The issue is, in the first half he'll be fighting for his life, so the points for an artillery headquarters would seem to be extravagant. But for the mid-game reinforcements, it's a real option for the defender, especially for the chance of disrupting an attacker's headquarters. If a player does not deploy an artillery regimental headquarters, but does deploy artillery elements, how does this occur? In most cases, the artillery elements will be allocated to on-playing area headquarters. A typical attacking force would consist of 3 battalion headquarters and a regimental headquarters. Allocating an artillery element to each would be optimal. If the artillery element are off the playing area, it's assumed they are always within emplacement range of their commanding artillery headquarters, which is otherwise occupied in another part of the front line. If the artillery element wants to go on the playing area, then they would need to be attached to the regimental headquarters and then allocated to the battalion headquarters. This would need to remain within emplacement range of the regimental headquarters in this case. Of course, the artillery element would be attached to the battalion headquarters, but this would cause so many problems and is not recommended. The only player can decide, but whatever decision is made, it must be documented before the game begins. Generally, indirect fire of this nature is all off the playing area. That is just simply the simplest way of dealing with it. The optimal artillery mission order to start the game would be a fire support mission order. Then any pre-game planned area or interdiction fire can be recorded. In this example on the slide, the artillery elements conduct area fire on game turn 2. Once this is completed, the artillery element returns to their fire support mission order. If there is no counter battery fire, then the only order a player needs to worry about during the game is the fire support mission order. Area and interdiction fire is all set before the game, so as long as you've guessed correctly, it will achieve its objective. The only reason why you would not do this is if you specifically want to conduct area fire on game turn 1, in which case the artillery elements have this order in place before the game starts, and during game turn 1 the regimental headquarters changes the order to fire support mission, so it's active on game turn 2. This would require the artillery elements to be attached to the regimental headquarters and thus within command and control range of the regimental headquarters. While the idea of laying down area fire on game turn 1 is attractive, it's often not useful, so I would not normally consider this. For the defender it's different. It's very useful to have interdiction fire on key roads coming onto the playing area on game turn 1. As the defender will often only have 1 or 2 artillery batteries, having this attached to the regimental headquarters is feasible, so the artillery mission orders can be changed on game turn 1. We will now cover aircraft, specifically aircraft missions. An aircraft flight must be under an aircraft mission order if it wishes to conduct any form of activity. Aircraft mission orders are either set before the game begins or during the phasing aircraft operational subphase. Except for tactical strike missions, they are executed the following game turn during the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase. Except for a ground support mission, aircraft missions do not require an observer. As a result, the attack or observation point will need to be defined when the mission order is set. Even for a ground support mission, the actual attack point will need to be specified, limited only by the need to be within range of the observed enemy element. Unlike artillery, when an aircraft conducts a mission, it returns to its base. When it reappears, it needs to have a new mission order set. The only exception to this is a cab rank squadron allocated to a headquarters, which is providing air support. This continues unless ordered otherwise. Players can use their aircraft in one of two ways, by flights or by cab rank. By flights, the aircraft are organised into flights. The flights can be used in any order or number required, but after their use they are unavailable for a number of game turns equal to their maximum sortie rate. If a player is using cab rank, the aircraft are divided by their minimum sortie rate to give the number of aircraft available every game turn. An aircraft flight or element must be a minimum size, and this may restrict the player's ability to use cab rank. When using cab rank, players can also use aircraft in the same manner as artillery, by allocating a squadron to a headquarters, allowing that headquarters to request air support missions in the same manner as fire support missions. This will be covered in more detail later in the video. During the air operation subphase, players place available aircraft or helicopters on the friendly player edge. This is to indicate they are ready to accept an aircraft mission order and be deployed on the playing area during the next game turn. If there are any aircraft or helicopters on the playing area, they are removed and returned to their base. Helicopters based on the playing area are returned to their on-playing area base. In addition to aircraft, any radar-equipped anti-aircraft elements must indicate if the radar is on and off. If on, they can be subject to anti-radar missile fire, but if off, their effectiveness is reduced. Once this has occurred, players can issue aircraft mission orders. This comes from the highest ranking on-player area headquarters. Aircraft missions which have been pre-planned are automatically considered to have the indicated aircraft mission order, so no additional action by the player is required in this case. Strategic or tactical strike missions can be set before the game begins, in which case a player must state the aircraft, weapon loads, game turn of arrival, and the attack point. A tactical strike mission issued during the game must be against an observed enemy element. Note, this location is the attack point and note the delay before the mission is conducted. Placing the aircraft on the game turn record chart corresponding to the game turn it's to arrive, a tactical strike mission can be issued during the sortie delay period, so the aircraft can be back in the air as soon as possible. If the attack point is very specific, use this when conducting the mission. If the attack point is not specific, place the attack point in any position compliant with the existing instructions and spin two six-sided dice to determine if the attack point moves. Ground support missions, in theory, can be set before the game begins, in which case a player must state the aircraft, game turn of arrival, and attack point. However, to avoid issues with sortie rates, this is only allowed if the mission occurs on game turn 1. The attack point must be within range of an observed enemy element. Assuming the attackers are on the player edge, in most cases there will be no observed enemy element, and this type of pre-planned mission would be impossible, so players should not permit this occurring in that case. When communicating a ground support mission order during the game, the attack point must be within range of an observed enemy element. Ground support mission orders are set during the phasing aircraft allocation subphase, and they are executed the following game turn during the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase. Tactical reconnaissance and observation missions, in theory, can be set before the game begins, in which case a player must state the aircraft, game turn of arrival, and the observation point or observation path. However, to avoid issues with sortie rates, this is only allowed if the mission occurs on game turn 1. A tactical reconnaissance and observation mission issued during the game can have the observation point or observation path set anywhere on the playing area. Tactical reconnaissance and observation mission orders are set during the phasing aircraft allocation subphase, and they are executed the following game turn during the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase. Tactical reconnaissance observation mission orders can be set to an aircraft on the friendly player's edge, or actually even in the sortie dead period time, so they can immediately come into action when they're available. AWAC and ELINT missions, in theory, can be set before the game begins, in which case a player must state the aircraft, game turn arrival, and the observation/attack point. However, to avoid issues with sortie rates, this is only allowed if the mission occurs on game turn 1. An AWAC and ELINT mission issued before the game can have an observation point set anywhere off the playing area. AWAC and ELINT missions orders are set during the phasing aircraft allocation subphase, and they are executed the following game turn during the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase. AWAC and ELINT mission orders can be only sent to aircraft on the friendly player edge. Although the rules don't specifically state it, I'm pretty certain they can also be sent to aircraft which are in the sortie dead time, which is when they're going back in their base, refueling, etc., etc. Cap and close escort missions, in theory, can be set before the game begins, in which case a player must state the aircraft and game turn of arrival. However, to avoid issues with sortie rates, this is only allowed if the mission occurs on game turn 1, or if escorting a strategic strike or tactical strike. A cap mission order issued before the game has the attack point set off the playing area. There is no attack point. A close escort mission order issued during the game must have an attack point set at the location, the aircraft it is escorting. Cap and close escort mission orders are set during the phasing aircraft allocation subphase, and they are executed the following game turn during the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase. Cap and close escort mission orders can be sent to aircraft on the friendly player edge or aircraft which are in the sortie wait period. ECM missions, in theory, can be set before the game begins, in which case a player must state the aircraft, game turn of arrival, and the observation point. However, to avoid issues with sortie rates, this is only allowed if the mission occurs on game turn 1. ECM missions can be general person or escort. A general purpose ECM mission order issued during the game can have the observation point set anywhere. An escort ECM mission order issued during the game must have the observation point set at the location of the aircraft it is escorting. ECM mission orders are set during the phasing aircraft allocation subphase, and they are executed the following game turn during the anti-aircraft and air attack subphase. ECM mission orders can be sent to an aircraft on the friendly player edge or in the sortie wait time phase. If an aircraft on the friendly player edge is not provided with a mission order, it remains on the friendly player edge until the following game turn. In summary, it is waiting for an order. An aircraft squadron on CAMRAG can be allocated to a headquarters, and ground support missions can occur in the same manner as fire support. In this case, when an observer sights an enemy element, it can immediately request air support, which results in the aircraft available on that game turn conducting a ground support mission against that enemy element on the same game turn. There is no delay in this case. This is pretty much the same as if you had artillery or indirect fire elements which are organically allocated or integral to a headquarters. The aircraft squadron is allocated to a headquarters, either regimental or battalion, during the air operation subphase. On the following game turn, during the air operation subphase, the allocation is active, and the following game turn, the observer can request air support. An aircraft squadron can be allocated to headquarters before the game begins. If you allocate it to a regimental headquarters, then if the battalion decides to observe, you do get a delay. But if the regiment observes the target, there is no delay. So it's pretty much the same as an integral indirect fire element, and does give you extremely greater responsiveness in terms of cap. The only problem with cap is that while you get a steady stream of aircraft each game turn, it is a steady stream. The enemy, if it's using flights, can always overwhelm you, so it should be used very carefully. Cap-ranked aircraft, which are available for use but not used in the game turn, are effectively wasted. The only benefit is that they would have suffered no casualties. It should be noted that cap-rank uses the minimum sortie rate rather than the maximum, so the wastage is not as great as you may otherwise think. Nonetheless, if you're using cap-ranked, you can be overwhelmed by the enemy if they use flights, and I generally always use flights. And so we come to an end of part 4 of the Corps Commander training series of videos, in this particular case covering command. Players should look at the next video if they wish to engage or continue in this epic journey. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.